Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and let me too add my welcome to those of you who've come from other parts of the world to come to the UK. I noticed that one of the titles, one of the slideshows that was up just now was subtitled "Disruption is all around us." And I can't think of a better way of encapsulating what's going on at the moment, but perhaps not in the way that some of you might have thought. What I'd like to do this morning is to speak for a comparatively short period of time. Then there will be an opportunity for questions or comments on anything I've had to say, or, being a former politician, anything I haven't said. I'll be more than happy to answer those questions before we move to the broader panel session that's about to take place. Now, when I was reflecting on what I might say to you this morning, I thought of all the things I could talk about, and then I thought, well, there's not much point really. Wherever you go, certainly in the UK, but increasingly in other parts of the world as well, there are only two subjects of conversation, whether it's at a business meeting like this or whether it's round the dinner table socially, and that is Trump and Brexit. Now, I'm not going to talk about the President of the United States. I'll leave that to others. But naturally, I am going to talk about Brexit. It's not the only show in town. There are other things going on, and I want to touch on one or two of these initially. But given that the decision taken in the referendum last year, we are about to face what I would argue is one of the biggest disruptions the United Kingdom has faced, certainly since the Second World War. And our progress towards moving to something different is perhaps taking rather longer than some of the optimists might have thought. Can I make it clear to you, for those who don't know, that I'm clearly on the side of those who believe that we should have stayed in the European Union, but I will try and give you a dispassionate view of what's going on as I can. All I can say is that if you're disappointed in that, you should have checked before you came along this morning. Let me just look, though, briefly at what is going on the context in relation to the Brexit decision, because I think you have to do that to understand where we are and where we might end up. So I want briefly to look at the growth prospects, not just in this country but elsewhere, to just touch on one of the things that is sometimes overlooked, some of the regulatory burdens that I know that you are exercised about because they affect you, which, regardless of what happens in the European Union, will still be with us. And I also want to say something about interest rates and quantitative easing. But I want to start by describing how we got here, because I think to understand Brexit and where we are now and where we might go, you have to understand the economic as well as the political situation that we're now in. And in many ways, I believe that we are living with the consequences of what happened nearly 10 years ago when the world's financial system came within hours of complete collapse. Because the economic consequences of that and the political consequences which flow from that are still with us and are likely to be here for some considerable time. That fracture to the system certainly did disrupt economic and political life, and that disruption is continuing, as I say, not just here but in other parts of the world as well. The economic consequences are self-evident. Austerity, as it has come to be known, has been applied in different ways in different countries, but essentially has been characterized by the fact that the economies in the UK and in Europe especially, though to some extent in the United States and in other parts of the world, have been growing far more slowly than people assumed. There was a sort of assumption, that economies would always continue to grow in this country because our economy has grown at 2.5% for the last 100 years. People have just assumed that it will always revert to that. I remember when I was in the Treasury 10 years ago, I remember asking some of our bright economists, how do we know it's always going to come back to 2.5%? And the answer was, well, because it does. And after that rigorous economic analysis, we moved on to something else. But I don't think you can make that assumption. And certainly if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years, and I know that's maybe a short time in the scheme of things, you can't assume that we're automatically going to return to the way that the world was beforehand. Within the European Union, it has been a long haul. It took a long time for the European economies as a whole to recover. And even today, of course, if you look at the performance of Germany, say, as opposed to some of the southern Mediterranean countries, they are different. And I have to say that if it had not been for the European Central Bank's actions in post-2011, then I think the situation in Europe would have been far worse. But the latest growth figures are encouraging. The European Union as a bloc is beginning to grow, although, as I say, that does conceal quite marked differences within the European Union. In the United States, where, frankly, it's been a slightly different picture to this side of the Atlantic because the US economy has been growing since 2008. The prospects are okay. The US economy is growing. We've seen some good figures. We saw a bit of what is sometimes referred to as the Trump effect, although I'm bound to say that it's not quite clear what that actually is. Whether or not he will get his tax cuts through and what difference that will make to the US corporate economy at any rate has yet to be seen. But the US economy is growing, and that does matter because, of course, it is the world's #1 economy. And on the other side of the world, if you want a modern view, a different view of globalization, just listen to what the Chinese president was saying last week. But the Chinese, despite the fact the economy has slowed a bit, are largely optimistic about the future. And indeed, if you were betting on who is likely to do well in the next few years, I think the prospects for Asia and China must be good, especially if we see what we're beginning to see in the Western economies, this mood of drawing in on ourselves, of perhaps drawing back from engagement in the world forums, and as well as the world economy as protectionism takes hold, the prospects for China must be good. And of course, in this country, our economy has been growing now for some time, although it is now slowing, though you might expect me to say it is a tragedy in my view that our economy now just about growing. We've now administered a self-inflicted wound which will have a long-term consequence on this country, for which I will probably see for the rest of my life. My fear is my children are going to have to put up with it as well. I just want to say one word about the European Union and regulatory burdens because I know that it's a concern to you. There are two big regulatory matters currently facing businesses in Europe and in this country too. One is the directive on how much you can charge for giving financial advice, colloquially known as MiFID II. The other one is the legislation going through that will impose quite considerable strains on all sorts of organisations and individuals in relation to data protection. These are classic cases of where someone meant well at the start, but like many other things, it simply gains momentum and gets bigger and bigger, and some of the unintended consequences are beginning to become rather obvious. All I was going to say in relation to that is that Britain may be leaving the European Union, but as we were about to implement legislation which adopts all European law into UK law, these things are still going to be with us. We may be leaving the European Union, but in order to be compliant with our biggest customer, many of the things that we have been concerned with will continue to concern us with in the future. They are there and likely to be there for some considerable time. I said I wanted to say a quick thing about interest rates and quantitative easing, and I would just say this. Quantitative easing was clearly the right thing to do in 2009. I say that because we introduced it, so therefore it must have been the right thing to do. But it was actually introduced as part of shock therapy to stop the economy going from recession into depression. It was never intended as a long-term fix for the economy. Which I think it has done to some extent. It's still there, it's been throttled back a bit, but it was never intended to be around almost 10 years later. And I think central banks are going to have to think quite clearly about how they withdraw this, because it simply is not sustainable to use quantitative easing in substitute to what I think is properly the role of fiscal policy. governments can and should and did in the past take action to prevent economies from slowing down or going into recession. But that has gone rather out of fashion over the last few years, and in my view, overmuch emphasis has been placed on what monetary policy can do. Monetary policy is there to combat inflation, to stop your currency being eroded. It is not there to act as a substitute for what governments ought to be doing. As you know, interest rates here went up for the first time in 10 years last year. I personally think that was premature, because I think there are enough forces dragging us back that I question whether a rise of even 0.25% is going to make much difference. But I do think we are going to have to look at the way in which central banks act, because the conventional way in which they did, where they did something and levers were pulled and there was action, I think is highly questionable, at least in the present time. We'll see here in the UK in 10 days' time what the present Chancellor has to say about this. But in my view, governments do need to ask themselves whether or not some of the things that they're asking the central banks to be doing ought not to be better done by themselves. So with that, I want to turn to the question of Brexit and where we are, and to look at the political fallout, if you like, of what happened 10 years ago. Austerity has not just had an economic effect, but it's also had a political effect. And one of the political effects it's had is that it is, I suppose, persuaded people to look more inwardly than they did in the past. People have got perfectly legitimate complaints about how they can see, on the one hand, some people seem to be doing quite well out of globalization, but they see around themselves in their own towns and cities where they live things that are not going so well. And indeed, globalization, the whole concept of globalization, where you had the breaking down of barriers, where you had countries being more outward-facing than ever before, has gone into retreat now, and it's been replaced by a more narrow, protectionist view of life. There has been growing skepticism and confidence in institutions. Sometimes it's just happened. Other times it has been of quite deliberate act by populist politicians who trash institutions as part of their argument that somehow things aren't working and things need to change, without being terribly clear about what it is that they're going to put in place. And it's not surprising that that populist approach, where people sometimes come up with, in my view, glib and easy answers to complex questions, has been triumphing, because frankly, on the liberal side of the argument, people haven't had a lot to say for the last 10 years. It's maybe difficult in the environment in which they find themselves, but it does seem to me that if we're going to make the case for people cooperating with each other, with trading with each other, recognizing that we're actually generally better off doing things together than we are by trying to ignore what is going on, that case has to be made. But as I say, it's not surprising. I said earlier that 10 years ago the banking system came within hours of collapse. I am fortunate in that I have only had one scary telephone call in my life, one where I was confronted with a situation that I thought could never happen. And it was about 3 weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the American bank. You'll remember those now iconic pictures of people streaming out of the building, clutching their belongings, only 10 years ago. And, within that period, at that time, in the UK government, we were working on plans to recapitalise our banks, because it was becoming increasingly obvious that some of them were in absolute dire straits. And that is why we've been working on this plan for some time. And at the beginning of October of 2008, I invited the chairman and chief executives of the British banks to come and see me so that we could discuss where we got to on all this. And I outlined the plan, not completely. I told them enough of what they were going on the night of the 7th of October 2008. And the last thing I said to them before they left is, do not repeat anything we've said tonight, because if people think we're going to recapitalise the banking system, it will cause chaos. Surprisingly enough, it took just 30 minutes for the FT to be on the phone with a very good account of what had happened at the meeting, followed by the BBC 5 minutes later with an equally accurate account of what was going on. The result was, the next morning, RBS, which at that time was the biggest bank in the world on many measures, which had a balance sheet about the size of the UK's GDP, to give you some sort of context here, there was a run on its bank. It lost billions. And I took this call from the then chairman of the bank, who said they were hemorrhaging money. and what was I going to do about it, which I thought was kind of interesting to ask me what he was going to do about his bank, but there you are. I said, well, look, you know we've got a plan almost ready to go. How long can you last? And what he said was what shook me to the core. He said, after a pause, maybe 2 or 3 hours. And if that bank had gone down, the cash machines would have gone off, the doors would have shut, and it wouldn't just have been RBS, but my guess is every bank in the Western world would have been subject to a run, because people would have wanted their money out. If the biggest bank in the world can collapse, well, you know, what's going to happen to the rest of them? And it's not surprising, actually, when you think of the trauma of that time, that people's faith in institutions and also their view of, you know, these guys, you know, are doing exceptionally well, but look what's happened and we're paying for it. It's not surprising that people have become more cynical and sceptical. I'll tell you one other thing that's an interesting aftermath to all that. At an earlier meeting, I'd met with the senior executives of another great British bank who said to me that I shouldn't worry too much, because they'd had a meeting recently, in fact the night before, and they said, from now on, we've only decided to take on risks that we understand. I did ask what they'd been doing prior to that, till it became very obvious in the ensuing days what exactly had been going on. But as I say, people's faith has been shaken in institutions. We've seen a growth of nationalism in Russia. We've seen it under Putin for some time. In Spain, you're seeing it even as we speak in Eastern Europe. And, you know, Gujan, when he was introducing me, mentioned Scotland. I led the campaign to persuade my fellow Scots that we were better together as part of the United Kingdom, and we won that referendum. I'd just say in passing, when it comes to referendums, you can actually win them, but you do need to do the work if you're going to get the result that you actually want. I don't think there will be another referendum in Scotland in my lifetime, because I think the issue is settled now. You know, if you look at the last general election, when it was quite clear from the way that people voted, they just don't want to be going over this over and over again. But you should not underestimate the feelings there are at the moment, that people are drawing inwards. They're saying, look, we want to look after ourselves, and that outward-looking view that has so characterised much of my younger life is not gone, but it's certainly parked. You know, I don't see it returning anytime soon. And so we come to the question of Brexit. As most of you will know, that the British government is in the process of negotiating our exit under something that is called Article 50 of the European Union treaties. I may say the European Union is something where it was never contemplated that anyone would leave. Just something you didn't do. And so consequently, when people say, so what happens next, it's difficult to answer that, because we're on a track that nobody was ever intended to be invited to go down. I think the real risk we've got at the moment is that time is rapidly running out. On the 29th of March 2019, if nothing else happens, we will be out of the European Union, and there will be nothing to replace it. It is a cliff edge. And why is time running out? Because given that the whole deal, if you can get a deal, has got to be concluded by about 12 months' time in October next year to allow it to be ratified by the European Parliament and by others, and given the fact that we haven't got an agreement on anything at all at the moment, I'm increasingly worried about that. Indeed, I would say there is a 50% chance of a failure in these talks in between now and March 2019. What happens if there is no agreement? Well, as I say, on the 29th of March of 2019, we are out. If there is no agreement on the exit terms, Article 50, and no trade deal, basically we then have to start trading with the European Union on World Trade Organization agreements. The tariffs there vary between 5 and 30%, depending on what you're doing, but it will have an effect. It'll have an effect on people in this country on their food prices very quickly. And of course, it isn't just the tariff barriers that you've got to take account of, it's the fact that we're in a customs union. There are many industries in this country at the moment where goods cross borders within Europe as they're being constructed, as they're being made. Financial services, for example, is not covered by the WTO. Neither are aviation agreements. There are 33 regulatory bodies in Europe that govern much of what we do. And no one ever contemplated that suddenly on the midnight on one particular day, all of this could come to an end. So what's wrong at the moment? Well, I think the big problem is that when we voted last year, whether or not we wanted to stay in the European Union, at no point did anyone say, well, this is plan B. You can stay, or if you leave, this is plan B, and you implement it. And indeed, one of the big difficulties at the moment is our government is completely divided on what our destination is. And when I hear talk about a transitional deal, which, by the way, I support, because you can't fix 40 years' worth of treaties in the space of 18 months, even if everybody has agreed on anything, you can only transition to something if you know where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, how can you transition? You can have a standstill agreement, which those of you in the room who were in the UK in the 1970s and 80s will know this is what trade unions had when you had a strike. You had a standstill agreement so you could talk and come to a solution at the end of the day. But that simply kicks the can down the road for another couple of years or so on. But what we really need to do in this country is to work out where we stand. What do we want? Now, I want as much trade as we possibly can. I think frictionless trade with the European Union is a very good thing, and for the life of me, I can't see how we're going to maintain it the way things are going at the present time. I think there are things like freedom of movement which are highly controversial in this country, which are sortable, actually, if there's the means to do that. But it's simply going the wrong way at the moment. And worse than that, what we're discussing is things that ought to be discussed at the end of the process, like how much money will we continue to pay the European Union? Well, that really depends on what the new settlement looks like. Are we going to pay for research in universities? Are we going to pay for access and so on? Equally, in relation to freedom of movement of people, and also the vexed question of what we do with the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the fact you've got unimpeded movement has been an integral part of the peace process we've seen for the last 20 years. These are things that logically you discuss at the end of the day rather than at the start. Quite why we signed up to it, I'm not sure. But unless we decide where we want to be, then I think this is going to be a very difficult issue to resolve. And how are you going to resolve it? Well, in my experience in the European Union, and I spent 13 years as a cabinet minister negotiating things, even when everybody agreed on something, it took years to sort it out. It's just the way it works when you've got 27 countries around a very big table. But it needs political engagement with the leaders in the rest of Europe, of which Angela Merkel is absolutely key to all that. You cannot do this by megaphone diplomacy across the Channel. It just simply won't work. I think there will be a deal done, frankly, because both sides need it to be done, but I can see it taking 4 or 5 years before you've got anything finalised, rather than the next 18 months. And then even after that, when you look at the myriad of things that you've got to sort out, then there will be a long time before you can say, well, this is what the world looks like. So what I'd say to you is that those of you who are doing business here, either from within the UK or coming from outside, there is going to be a deal of uncertainty and disruption for some time to come. What I would like to see, and I am not optimistic here, is an outbreak of common sense on both sides of the Channel. Both sides need a deal. That means on this side of the Channel, we have to say to people, all trade deals, all agreements involve a degree of compromise. You tell me any trade deal entered into freely anywhere in the world where there wasn't a degree of compromise. There is a degree of compromise, and that is going to have to take place, and it's in our interests that we actually do it. And equally, from the other side of the Channel, yes, they need a deal too. But if you look at what is going on in Europe today, the 27 are united in relation to how much money they want to get out of us, maybe, but there is no way that you are ever going to get an ultimate political union of the sort that France and Germany sometimes talk about, that brings in countries in the former Eastern Europe, or indeed the Mediterranean countries. It just isn't going to happen. And indeed, many of the negotiations I was involved in, it was quite obvious there are distinct views as to how Europe ought to be progressing. And perhaps it is a time, 50, 60 years after the European Union was, the idea was first conceived, that perhaps they should have an opportunity to reset and say, well, what should the world look like for the next 50 years? And we could easily be part of that, not, part of an integrated centre like that, because, you know, I for one, was always against us thinking about joining the euro. It just doesn't suit the United Kingdom, but I think a deal can be done. And I just, you know, say, by way of passing, the idea that somehow it doesn't matter about Europe, we can do deals everywhere else in the rest of the world. Well, just think about it. It's no accident that these things take 7 years when the going is good to get an agreement. But if you want an example of where the difficulties are, look at what happened in the last month, 6 weeks, when Bombardier, a British, a Canadian company but making aeroplanes in Northern Ireland, it's proposed to slap a tariff of nearly 200% on its products and aeroplanes that are exported into the United States. That's what America First means. You know, if you pursue this line of putting barriers in trade, it has consequences, and it has consequences for jobs as well. So I think a deal will be done, but it will take time. My own guess is that we will have the traditional crisis meeting that characterises all European gatherings sometime in about 12 months' time, when a deal will be done to roll the thing forward to give us more time. And if you want to know what I mean by that, one of the last meetings I ever attended in the European Union was just after the general election here in 2010. There was a short gap between us leaving office and the coalition government being formed because the British government has to continue. I had to go and represent the UK, and that was to sort out the Greek crisis. The Greek crisis is not sorted out 8 years later. It takes time, which is why, you know, if you think I'm being unrealistically pessimistic about these things, I would argue I'm just being realistic. But key on our side is to get clarity, and as long as the divisions in government and elsewhere exist, that simply is going to take an awful lot of time. Let me conclude by saying, where can you be optimistic in an otherwise difficult world? Well, firstly, there is growth in the global economy, as I said, and we should not lose sight of that. In different parts of the world, the economies are growing, the opportunities are there, not just for people in this country, but elsewhere as well. The second thing is the UK still has formidable strengths. One of them is the City of London, and, you know, being somebody who lives in Edinburgh, I'm using this in a generic way, because the financial services industry isn't just based in London. It employs roughly 10% of our workforce and contributes almost the same in GDP throughout the whole of the United Kingdom, not least in the city in which I live. But it still has immense strengths. London and New York are the preeminent financial centres in the world, and that is likely to continue for some time. I think Brexit will, of course, have an effect on some jobs in London, and it's never a good idea to ask people to think where they ought to be. But there is still a great strength here, and that is not going to disappear overnight or anything like it. And, of course, we have a domestic market of 60 million of people with strong sectors in engineering, the financial sector I've mentioned. So there are a lot of positives there on which we can build. It's just a pity that in a world which is always going to be more difficult and which is changing much more quickly than it has done in the past, as I say, that we have decided to take something of a detour while we sort all this out, and so it may take time to do that. So I hope I've been able to give you an overview of where I think things are at the present time. I think that it is perfectly possible, if there are reasonable people about, for us to get a concluded deal and to move on from this. There is no going back, in case you ask that. You have a referendum, you ask people, you can't just go back and say, you've made a terrible mistake, we need to think again. You simply can't do that. So I am of that mind, where I think something new has to be forged, but to do that, you need a dose of common sense and realism, and just at that moment, I think it's in rather short supply. So, with that, I'd now be happy to answer questions on anything I said, or, as I said earlier, anything I didn't say. Who would like to be first? Yes. You may have to shout, because I've got a microphone and you don't. Others are. Someone's anticipated this.
I thought I'd jump straight in. You don't get these chances very often, and it's very difficult to choose one question on Brexit. But given that you're saying fiscal policy needs to be loosened, and it's likely that a Labour government might come in, given the kind of trend that seems to be happening in society, do you think it would be possible that the Labour government or the Labour Party could take a stance against Brexit? Because there doesn't seem to be a leading political force arguing against it. Everyone just seems to want to toe the line and say the public was correct.
Okay.
At what point will that be revisited, do you think?
Well, look, 2 points that I would like to make. One is the point I was just concluded on. I've voted to remain. It's a question of the day for every politician or ex-politician in the United Kingdom. If there was a vote tomorrow, I would still vote the same way. I haven't changed my mind on that. But I'm very clear. We've had 2 referendums in this country, one in Scotland, one in the UK. If you hold a referendum and you ask people what they think, and they think something different to you, well, you've got to abide by that result. Nothing would do more to undermine people's confidence in the system, the political system, if we were to say, sorry, you got it wrong and we're going to do something different. And I said throughout the Scottish campaign, this is our one and only chance. If we vote to leave, that's it, you can't go back. And I think people voted on that basis. Similarly, in relation to Brexit. So the question, therefore, is what deal can you get out of it? And it's fair to say that if you look ever since the referendum, all the political parties and indeed just about everybody else have been sometimes reticent on actually what sort of world they would like to see. What I would say is that the Labour Party in the last few months has made it clear that in relation to access to the single market, the customs union and so on, they've taken a much more robust stance, and those, the votes will come up in Parliament over the next few months in relation to that. And critically, they've also said that Parliament, and I think this is an important point, should have the final say on whether we sign up to the deal or not. For everybody on the Brexit side who said, take back control, well, I agree with them. Parliament has to be supreme here. So, yeah, I think the Labour Party position has hardened up quite a lot over the last few months. But I think what we all need to do is to be just a bit clearer about what sort of world, when you go into negotiation, what do you want to get out of it? I'm struck by the fact that I was speaking at something in continental Europe a few weeks ago, and someone came up to me and said, what do you guys want? And I found that very difficult to answer because, I'm afraid the government, of which I am no longer a part, doesn't actually know. Right, who else? There's a man 2 tables back.
Hi, this follows up slightly from the last comment you made about not knowing what we want. But going back to the one big issue that you profiled, which was that populist politicians have made good play by trashing the reputation of global institutions and more local institutions. What do you think should be the way forward in terms of the way those institutions at any level should change?
Well, you're absolutely right that this isn't just a matter for government and ministers and so on. And my prescription for different institutions is, obviously different. Self-evidently, I suspect that people's view of Westminster and the Houses of Parliament at the moment is taking another dip after the last few days. Incidentally, it's a remarkable picture you had of Westminster. And I have to congratulate the organisers of this conference. You actually shifted the House of Commons and the buildings next to it to different sides of the Thames, which must have taken some doing. But maybe that's a warning of what's going to come. So I think MPs, politicians, others need to make sure they keep their own house in order so that they don't do things that lead to a diminution of respect. Self-evidently, things like banks and so on, I think they're a lot stronger and better capitalised than they were, but there are still, changes to be made. But I think what people really want to see is that, that when you have got a government or when you've got an economy, it's working for them. They don't feel that things are being taken away and there aren't any gains from it. Ironically, we have one of the highest rates of employment that we've ever had. But for a lot of people, even though the employment may have gone up, they just don't feel that way. But restoring confidence means acting competently, being clear about what you want, where you want to go. And if you do that, then I think you can get people to say, okay, we're prepared to go on a journey with you. If you can't do that, and today in the UK, it's rather obvious that we're not in that happy position yet, then you will simply drift. It's nice to see the furniture being moved in rather than being repossessed. So. I think there is a man here holding up a poster which says your time's up. Not for the first time I've been shown a card like that. Which I think means that we are about to move to the panel discussion. And with that, I'll hand over to somebody who will tell us what to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.